Welcome to Missouri Assistive Technologies WCAG 2.1 training. It's a collaborative between Missouri Assistive Technology and the state of Missouri's Office of Administration. We are so excited to have Lainie Strange presenting today. She is our guru, and I would say for Missouri, but she is known throughout the U.S. as well. And so she's our Office of Administration web developer, as well as the web accessibility specialist, and what I would say is our go-to person. Everyone keeps her busy with questions. So we're so excited that she's talking today about 2.1, and then she'll tell you later in the fall, we're also going to do one when 2.2 becomes required. So take it away, Lainie.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, our Missouri as well as our across the US listeners today. And I think some of us, we have someone from Phoenix. I think I'd like to be in Phoenix, actually.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. I'm going to. All right. I'm going to go ahead and take my video off so it's not too distracting. And so the focus of this is just the WCAG 2.1 guidelines specifically. And Brenda mentioned WCAG 2.2, which the state of Missouri is going to be implementing that in the fall, specific to our state standard that we updated last year. So, but we are going to go over just kind of like a general overview about the 2.1 guidelines. And then we're going to walk through the 12 guidelines, and discuss, who it affects and, testing tools that can kind of aid you in, implementing the guideline and checking to see if how it's implemented, etc. So there should be a lot of good tips and tools that come out of this, and we have a copy of this presentation that we can share with you all that will have all those links in there. I even included some information on tips to help prioritize like all the guidelines, and it kind of gets into critical ones and higher priority ones. Obviously, they're all important, but there is kind of a pecking order priority that, some of them have a greater impact on, accessibility as far as like kind of stopping you in your tracks, so to speak. And then just mentioning WCAG 2.2, and that we'll do another similar webinar like the one today. We will do that in the fall. There's not as many added guidelines under 2.2, but there's still a few of them. And then a lot of the resources that I mentioned throughout the presentation, I'll include at the end. And I've also got links kind of throughout it. So one way or another, you'll have links to the information that we talk about. All right, so WCAG, or the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, was released in June 2018. And with that, there are 5 level A, 7 double A, and 5 triple A. And I will not be discussing triple A, as we don't require triple A. Federal government doesn't require triple A. And so when it comes to AAA, it's just, kind of a if you want to implement type of situation. So based on that, we will be covering 12, the A and the double A. And WCAG 2.1 works with 2.0 and is backwards compatible. So, 2.1 just builds on the, 1.0 and 2.0 versions. And the total combined guidelines with 2.0 and 2.1 are 30. So Missouri, so we updated our standard last year and we were actually just a little ahead of when they finally announced the Title II update. We had already planned on going to 2.1, so we were right in alignment with that. So that was helpful. And we implemented it September 2024 with a 6-month window, which would mean next month, to kind of get people, up to speed, educate, etc., on what exactly those guidelines entail. And then moving forward, the expectation is all of those new 12 are implemented in all of our testing processes. So just a little bit of background on kind of the idea behind the 2.1 criteria that were added. And there was an expansion for mobile and an improved support for touch interactions, keyboard and mouse, and it avoids unintended activation of device sensors, expands for low vision. As you'll see as we go along, it extends contrast requirements to not just text, but also to graphics in particular situations, graphics and other type of elements, and improves text and layout adaptability. So it kind of gets into kind of expanding in more detail about how responsive design should work, and some expansion on magnification, etc. And it also expands for cognitive and learning disabilities. And so it enables more detailed description of page controls and elements to support personalization of user interfaces. And then I also just wanted to put a nod to, what is the target audience for the guidelines? Specifically, most of the 2.1 guidelines are going to be implemented by a web developer or designer. But I kind of see, everybody that's on this call today, they have the ability to be an accessibility champion. And by listening to this and kind of better understanding these guidelines, and also learning some tips and tricks on testing, you can kind of be, part of, the push for accessibility. You may not be the person that implements the accessibility, but as staff who may test out features on websites or test out things in our web applications, this empowers you to better understand what these guidelines are about and gives you a better understanding of how to test for them. Because you'll see some of these little tips and stuff are, things that you can access via your browser. So, but we'll expand on that a little bit more. So primary web developers and designers, but I see all staff as people that, can champion all of these efforts. So we're going to go ahead and just start jumping in to the guidelines. And the first one has to do with orientation and, mobile devices like, tablets, mobile phones, etc. And it requires authors not to rely on a screen orientation. There's definitely exceptions that you can look at in the rule. There can be situations where just the nature of the application needs it to be one orientation or the other, but by default, you need the ability to, flip it horizontal or vertical. And who does this help and how? Users who have their devices mounted or cannot change orientation can still use the site, even though they have a fixed orientation. So, you have to think about all the scenarios of people that may not have the ability to just quickly flip an orientation. So examples of how orientation is controlled is through CSS, or what we call styles that, control how things look behind the scenes. And there is a orientation media feature that allows adjusting layout based on screen orientation. There's also an API that's called the Screen Orientation API, and it's like a JavaScript API that allows for working with screen orientation, including the ability to lock it to a specific orientation. So just kind of educating you on ways that it could potentially be locked. And those are the areas where as someone who has to, maybe fix an accessibility feature related orientation, these are the kind of places where you would look if there's an issue with that. Okay, next, 1.3.5, identify input purpose. So this addresses using the autocomplete attribute on form fields to indicate the purpose of common inputs where technology allows, which, all of our browsers of today can allow for this kind of ability. And some of you maybe notice when you go to certain websites that you go to fill in your name or you go to fill in your email, that it pulls from some stored information in your browser. And how convenient is that? Who wants to have to retype their email address over and over and over again? So this is something programmatically done behind the scenes. And we have here, we talk about the input field. On this next one, it talks about the input field serves a purpose identified. And then I have a link here, the input purposes for user interface components. And that has a list of all the autocomplete. So we're talking, name, address, email, phone, kind of a lot of those, common types of things that we're filling in, multitudes of times. And so it allows the browsers that it can suggest and autofill the right content without you having to manually enter it in. So who does it help? Users with various cognitive disabilities, including people with language and memory related disabilities and disabilities that affect executive function and decision making. And as we all know, as with any accessibility feature, it ends up, benefiting everybody that ends up being able to use it. And there is a autocomplete bookmarklet, and I have an image here to the right on my screen that I can click the autocomplete bookmarklet, and it's basically for bookmarklets. You're just bookmarking it in your browser. To access it, you click it. And in this case, you see here, autocomplete equals name, autocomplete equals organization. So this screenshot shows an example of where those properties were set up behind the scenes by the developer. And so if you have that information stored in your browser, it can just pull from a dropdown and you can automatically put those in. So really good feature, and I can see, big benefit to incorporating. Now, is there autocomplete for every single form field under the sun or every, input field? No, these are just like your common ones that you're going to come across when you're, doing, just different transactions, and you have that kind of that overarching common set of data about yourself that would be beneficial to be able to just autocomplete in there. Okay, reflow 1.4.10. Content can be presented without loss of information or functionality and without requiring scrolling in 2 dimensions for, and we've got some explanations here, but I'll kind of get into more of the layman's terms and in how this actually works. But what you're testing for is the ability that a width of a screen is 320 and the height of a screen is 256, and a 1280 pixel width set to 400%. So So there is a browser extension which is approved for state of Missouri staff that you can use this resize window option, which I'll show here on the next screen, that you can test this feature out to see if it works. So reflow impacts desktop browsers, mobile device browsers, and native mobile apps. So it's not just something that affects, like, you know, your phone display. And users with low vision who need to make things larger are that target audience. The content will wrap inside the viewport instead of causing horizontal scroll, or, you're also looking for things being clipped, or, different things like that. So moving on to my next screen, I just
Lainie,
wanted,
can I just interrupt really quick?
yeah, yep.
I meant to say in the beginning, but for some new users to web content, could you just briefly define the difference between A and AA and AAA, just real quick?
Yeah, I can definitely do that. So basically, A, AA, and AAA, it's kind of a priority level. So A is a higher priority than AA, and AAA is a higher priority than AA, meaning that, kind of in a nutshell, it's more critical to implement, A level, guidelines versus AA. So if you needed help in kind of prioritizing your work, and you're kind of just, biting off and kind of doing things in phases, you would target your A. And what I mean by that is there's cases where guidelines that aren't followed under just the single A, it can kind of stop people in their tracks. So, for example, just really quick, there's an A that has to do with like keyboard trap. Keyboard trap means that as I'm tabbing through, as a screen reader user, etc., and it suddenly stops me in my tracks, I can't do business on that site. So it kind of stops you in your tracks, so to speak. So they've kind of set this A, AA, and AAA to kind of help guide you to know that some are more critical to implement than others. Now, the federal Title II and our state guidelines require that both A and AA. So when I say that, I don't mean AA doesn't need to be implemented. If you need to prioritize, I would definitely look at A first and then AA. AAA sometimes can get more into, niche based things for very specific kinds of disabilities. And I'm not to say that you shouldn't maybe take a look at some of those. There's some AAA things that speak to like plain language and things like that. And plain language is a very critical element. So there could be some areas that you still want to explore under AAA, but from a legal perspective, A with the highest priority and AA with the next highest priority.
Thanks, Lainie. That's real
Oh, no,
helpful. And I
no.
appreciate the example of the screen reader and the keyboard because, like you said, someone who's using JAWS or NVDA, having that as an A priority, then they basically, if they can't do that, they cannot do anything else on the website. So that's really
Correct.
key that they be able to navigate fully the page with
Yep.
their keyboard. So, yep.
And then another good example would be having a form and having all of the form fields properly labeled behind the scenes by a web
Yes.
developer. And if they're not labeled, all bets are off. You can't,
Yep.
someone non-visual could not fill out the form, and they would have to go, seek help in another way. So it stops doing business, and they leave. So there's another example of something that is like an A level guideline.
Yeah, perfect.
All
Thanks.
right, no problem. So this example talks about reflow, and in the previous screen I talked about um, uh, when you test for this, you set the browser window to a 1280 pixel width, and then you increase your magnification to 400%. So in what we're looking at right here in this screenshot is it's a browser extension, and it's basically like the icon looks like a window with arrows pointing from each corner, and it's called the window resizer. And then you can go to a web page, you can click on it to activate it, you'll get a pop-up, and then there is a window, an input where you can set your width to whatever you want. And in this case, right below it, there is an input box with 1280. And then I hit enter at the end of that. And what you'll notice when you do this on your own is it suddenly takes that browser window and it'll likely shrink it depending upon what your default kind of width is on your laptop or your desktop, etc. And it'll adjust it for testing purposes. And then under your browser properties, there is a area that you can do zoom, and you would move that up to 400%. So in my example here to the left, I have the Missouri Assistive Technology homepage. The left image is the homepage set at a normal 100% on my computer. And then the one to the right is that same screen set to 1280 width at 400%. And then you take that view and you scroll up and down as kind of part of the testing process and make sure that you're still visibly able to interact with the page, see the content, nothing is cutting off to where you can't navigate to it. You're not, clipping text at the bottom or, anything like that. You're kind of looking for what we call responsive design, where it takes all your content and reflows it into that 1280 width. Now, 1280 width, you don't have to, there's nothing in this guideline that talks about it has to be a certain height. It just affects the width. So 1280 and 400%. Just kind of a little side note for those of you that may be familiar with WCAG 2.0, there is a guideline in there that directly discusses being able to magnify to 200. So this is the 2.1 is an expansion on that. And we do have a link. We do have a link at the end of the presentation if you want to do a refresher on 2.0, since we're specifically talking about the 2.1 guidelines here.
Lainie, on this extension, that is free, correct? And it works on both the Windows Edge
Yes.
and Chrome browser.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. And I think everything I mention in this presentation is all free things.
Yeah.
So
I
always target free things.
I know. We love free.
And just like we talked about, NVDA is a screen reader that is free to use as part of your testing process. So that's really nice. Okay, moving on. 1.4.11 non-text contrast. Under the WCAG single A, there's something that talks about text contrast that you can review looking at a 2.0 presentation. This is referring to non-text contrast, and I'm going to have another screen that gives some examples so you can kind of put it into perspective what we're talking about. And it covers contrast ratio of 3:1 against what we call adjacent colors. And typically that's going to be, you know, the background of the page, or it might be the background of a button, or different things that I'll get into and show you here on the next one. But it affects user interface components like input, field outlines, different things like that. Graphical objects, you know, many times you'll see icons used in place of, you know, other types of labels, and I'll give you some examples of that. It gets into chart elements like line charts and pie, you know, pie pieces in a chart, things like that. Who does it help and how? Users with low vision and cognitive disabilities need help seeing or perceiving information in graphics, interactive components, and focus indicators. So we have these other elements, you know, these are elements that are equally just as important to be able to decipher as kind of like text contrast. And moving on, here is some of my examples. So in this case, we have, I've got like 6 examples here of non-text contrast, and then I'll kind of explain what it is we're specifically talking about. So the first one is a search box, and what we're talking about is the kind of that outline, visual focus of the search box itself, the dark gray outline of that search box. That's the non-text object, and the white surrounding it is the adjacent color, and it has to pass a 3-to-1 color contrast, and I'll talk a little bit about how you can test that too. The next one is here we have another input box. Now, in this case, it is, if you look very closely, there's a visual focus indicator, and there is a kind of a gray, there's actually a gray, if you look closely to the name box, there's a gray outline, and it has to contrast with that dark blue background. So so these are just kind of, you know, input boxes, so to speak. You have to consider how those are outlined and what they look like whenever you're focusing to them. Next is 3 blue buttons. And you'll notice there is one, the second one has a green outline. And some it may not be specifically looking like this because of color blindness, but there is a pronounced outline around the middle one. And that happens whenever you give it focus or your keyboard tabbing to it. And so that green outline, that the green outline is the contrast to it is the white background. So green outline, that focusable thick outline to the white background. The next we have a check mark. And so the check mark itself is like a light gray, and then the background of the check box is kind of a purplish blue. And so in this case, the light gray is that non-text element because it represents, you know, a check mark or indicating that element in maybe a series of check marks. You know, it kind of a similar concept to like radio buttons that are round radio buttons. So the purple in this case is the adjacent color or the background, and that's where the contrast is. And this complies with a 3-to-1 color contrast ratio. Moving on to the right, we have an icon. It's a white telephone, which is our non-text object. And then the orange background is what it has to contrast with. So, and then moving on to our pie chart example, we have pie chart pieces, and then the adjacent / background color, again, is just the white of our presentation here. One thing I wanted to pay close attention to is you'll notice there is a yellow pie piece, and it's representing, in this case, there's a label next to it called Safari. You'll notice that that one is outlined in a kind of like a dark gray / black, and that is because that is a way to implement and pass accessibility, because natively that yellow against the white would not be passing a color contrast ratio of 3:1. So in this case, we could have done a couple things. We could have darkened that yellow to pass the 3:1, or you can actually provide an outline to that pie piece, and that outline now is that contrast to the background. In addition, you'll notice, the other pie pieces don't have that gray outline, but for consistency's sake, you could have added the outline to all of the pie pieces. But in the instance of the yellow pie piece you see here, that was required for it to hold the proper contrast. By itself, all of the other pie charts actually hit that 3:1 ratio. And at the end, we'll have some links to free tools that you can test. One of them is called the Color Contrast Analyzer. It's a free desktop tool. There's also a contrast checker by WebAIM, and it's an online tool, and you can test on that. And, outside of the scope of this, we have resources to kind of teach you how to use those tools on the Missouri Assistive Tech ICT accessibility site. But
And
that's how we would.
Yeah, they are very intuitive too. Sorry to interrupt.
No, jump in.
The tools that you're talking about are super easy. That if you just download like that color contrast, I didn't have time to read the directions the first time. I'm really bad about that anyway. And I went on and was just able to use the little dropper, check the contrast. It told me the numbers and the relation, and it's super easy. So I know some of it may seem like it's really difficult, but it's not. So
right. And I think we've even got MoAT has a YouTube channel that cover a lot of the topics where we expand on specific topics. So
thank you.
And that's some good information there.
Yeah, it's just under Missouri Assistive Technology, but there's a specific playlist that has the ICT information. So thank you for that.
Oh, yeah. All right. Next is 1.4.12 text spacing, and requires authors not to interfere with user style sheets and other CSS-based client-side interventions. Users can adjust text spacing to make it easier to read. So it is very common for low vision or cognitive, disabilities to adjust how spacing looks, word spacing, font spacing, line height. Natively, you can go in with a browser and you can kind of override what the default spacing is for, a website. So you just have to make sure that you're not blocking the ability that that this can be done, easily. So now we go in here and it talks about line height has to be at least, and it kind of rolls through and explains what the requirements are. And then
Lainie,
to make it,
just a second again. Someone just said that their PowerPoint is not showing on the screen, that they're just seeing you. Is anyone else having that issue?
I can see the PowerPoint.
Okay.
So I wonder if maybe they're having like some bandwidth issues or something. Or
Yeah.
maybe, yeah, maybe logging off and logging on possibly
Yeah.
might fix your problem.
I can see the
Um,
PowerPoint, but it also says that the recording has stopped.
Yeah, and so that is that's the otter recording, the captioning, but we do have the captions in the Zoom meeting as well. So I apologize for that confusion.
Great,
So,
thanks.
yeah, so turn on your captioning if you need it, and if anyone is not getting that, please send me a direct message in the chat. Thanks.
all right. So there is I'm going to kind of jump down to my last bullet. There is a bookmarklet, and bookmarklet simply work where you go to the link and you can drag it into your favorites, your bookmarks, browser bookmarks, and you click on it, and it will automatically set the settings to these 4 settings here for line height, spacing, letter spacing, word spacing. So it helps speed up the process of testing. So it's really handy. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about what typically causes a spacing issue to where it does interfere, just kind of given some tips to web developers should they come across this issue. A lot of times it will be related to creating size constrained style sheet borders or boxes around text, and or setting the overflow property of elements to hidden. And so these are kind of some of the culprits if you end up having the issue. I have a screenshot here of, it's kind of like a 3-column, and you'll notice that kind of at the end of each one of these columns, it's clipping off the text. And this is an example of where behind the scenes, they set the kind of the element box to a constrained, very specific width. And so when it tries to do any, adjustments by custom CSS or spacing or anything, it starts clipping it. So then you just need to go back, and it kind of just comes down to, you kind of hear the term responsive design. That just means the ability to, respond to, changes in, width of the page or spacing of the text, and it needs to be able to flow and still be visible on the page. So in this case, it started clipping text. So if you use the text spacing bookmarklet on web pages and you click it, and then what you'll immediately notice that it'll kind of space out the text and space out the words. That kind of the process for the test is to go down and see, am I seeing any text that's clipping at the bottom or clipping off to the side or any of that? And then that's, then your developers or your style designers, we need to go back and see what they might possibly be doing that's affecting the ability to override the style and to override and for users to use their own ability to use spacing, etc.
Lainie.
Yeah.
Thank you for saying that. Just for some of the participants that may be new, we have had some past trainings that are strictly for, web developers. And today we've got both web content and web developers. And so I'm glad that you said that when you're testing, so anyone who's doing like the web content testing and they're going to use this text spacing bookmarklet, hopefully that, I mean, not hopefully, but it may mean that you are not necessarily responsible for fixing that, but like Lainie said, responsibility to let your web developer know that. So just so that you're not overwhelmed by the thought of, oh my gosh, I have to do all of this.
Right, exactly.
That depends on your position and what you're doing, where you're at. But we wanted to do this training so that you are aware that just what you need to tell your web developer if you are not the web developer. And
Exactly.
yeah, and having these free sources to be able to find these the things in testing that need to be fixed, or hey, you may use this text spacing bookmarklet and find out that, oh my gosh, your web page is awesome. So thanks for making that delineation, Lainey.
Yeah.
I just
Yeah.
wanted to emphasize that to
Yeah. And again, like, you know, the bookmarklet is something that state employees can use. Anybody can. Some of you may simply be in the, you know, you might be involved in kind of testing new things on websites or web applications. So this kind of gives you kind of some tools to help you out here. Okay, content on hover focus. I won't get into all of the details. This has to do where receiving and then removing pointer, hover, or keyboard focus triggers additional content to become visible and then hidden. The following are true. So we have a dismissible option, hoverable option, and persistent option. My next screen is going to kind of go into this is kind of the language of the guidelines. Again, if you were to go look at the guidelines, it'll speak to it, but then it'll get into, you know, kind of layman's terms, and I'm kind of including that layman's terms. Users with low vision who need to work without hover behavior obscuring content. So, you know, off to the right here, I have an example of something that's popping up whenever I click, you know, there's a little icon there and I have something that's popping up. So what this has to do with is how I'm able to interact with that pop-up without, you know, without any issues. So I'm gonna go into the next screen to the next slide to kind of explain what this means. So the hover and focus from a web development standpoint is managed via styles or CSS and JavaScript. So this is where from a, you know, where it's managed. To test, you make sure both keyboard and mouse activate pop-ups, not one or the other. So again, just a keyboard test would determine that. If you have pop-ups that aren't popping up, it means that something was done on a hover versus a hover and a focus. On pop-up, focus, or hover, press the escape key to see if the pop-up closes. And on hover, make sure you can move your cursor around any area of the pop-up and that message doesn't go away. So a couple of examples here. I have the first one is a series of like 3 buttons, and I am focusing to the second button, and then I'm getting this little pop-up. And then if it's built correctly, I can hit the escape key and make that pop-up go away, because as you notice, it was obscuring the third button whenever that pop-up occurred. So you just have to have these things in place to make life easier so that it's easier to interact with things that have pop-ups. Natively, this stuff's built in, but you just want to make sure that, you know, that the escape key will work and it will dismiss that pop-up. Then we have a refresh button off to the right side, and it has a pop-up of refresh. So in this case, you'll see the cursor hovered over the button, and then you'll notice that I can move around the screen. I can move over the button and I can move over the pop-up, and I still see the pop-up. So we don't want things just randomly disappearing as we're moving our cursor around, so that we're still getting the information that we need. And, you know, again, in this case, we have a refresh icon, and then we have the refresh pop-up to, you know, to kind of give dual example what that means, what that icon means. So these are the things that are affected by content or hover or focus. All right, character key shortcuts. So some of you probably use character key shortcuts, some of the basic ones, Control P, Control S for save. There's a lot of different things. You can also build in shortcuts into web pages or web applications, etc. This guideline says it requires authors to not use single key shortcuts or provide a way to turn them off or change them. So, and here's an example. So it helps people that, for example, users of speech to text software, and meaning you speak and it converts it into text or into some sort of interaction. So here's where it could be an issue. For example, if your web page form hijacks the A key, let's say you create a shortcut where all you have to do is type an A or interact and say the word A, and it does a shortcut, let's say to enter an address into the address field, that just kind of a general example. When the user dictates words that include like that letter, let's say happy, and they spell HAPPY, the shortcut could be triggered whenever they say the word A. And then suddenly you have things not working the way as intended. Is it overly common that, one character shortcuts are done? Probably not, but you want to make sure that there's not a reason you would ever do them, because in this case, you just need the ability either to not use them or a way to turn them off. But this is a good example explaining, what would happen to someone if you used one key shortcuts, in a web application or something like that. Okay. So pointer gestures, this gets into your mobile devices, and this has to do with it, like multi-point or path-based gestures. And okay, so it says all functionality that uses multi-point or path-based gestures for operations can be operated with a single pointer without a path-based gesture, unless a multi-point or path-based gesture is essential. So in a nutshell, what it's saying here is if you have something that is touch-based, like pinching and zooming a map, or sliding, or path-based where you can slide a slider from left to right, you have to have the ability to do that in, another way that does not, require to use physical touch to do it. So this could be, in this case, like a map may have like a plus or minus button, so you can keyboard to it and zoom in and out that way. Or like in the case of like path-based, you also have the ability, if you have a slider, to also use your, back and forward keys to slide along a path, for example. So those are examples where you don't want to limit someone, in a like a mobile device type of situation or touch screen situation. Okay, pointer cancellation, and I've got some examples that I'll kind of get into with this, but this has to do with, and again, this is kind of a developer thing, requires authors to use an up event triggering on interactive components. So for functionality that can be operated using a single pointer, at least one of the following is true: no down events, abort or undo, up reversal, or and then it talks about essential. And basically, kind of like, in a nutshell, what this means, you'll notice when you're, you click down and then your action happens when you unclick or click away. You never want the ability to do an action just by clicking, what they call like a down event. So you always want the ability to be able to kind of escape out of things, etc. And who does this affect? Dexterity, disabilities, who, miss targets. It ensures the target is not triggered on a touchdown, but rather on touch up, or that up or click away to move their finger away from the wrong target if they miss. So, and I've got a little bit more information about this on the next screen. To correctly implement, this is from the developer standpoint, use native on-click event in JavaScript. On-click events are triggered on the up event by default, not the down event or kind of that click or focus. In HTML native, button or an href, which is like a link, on-click events are triggered on the up event. So just think of it as you're clicking, clicking away or releasing the mouse click, etc. That's when the event needs to occur. So that one's a little more technical.
Yeah, but it actually, thanks, Lainie, it actually affects several different people, like anyone using eye gaze, anyone using scanning, I mean, there's a lot of people, especially with AAC, that this affects.
Yes. Great examples. Thanks for kind of putting that into putting it into relation to AT devices. Okay, label end names requires any visible label that is not the accessible name to be part of the string that makes up the accessible name. And so an example, speech users say click go, like speech to text. They say the word click go. And you see down below, I have a blue button that says go with an arrow on it. And if they see a button with the word go visually on it, but let's say behind the scenes, the button has a behind the scenes label of submit, then that command would do nothing because it's waiting to hear or to activate submit. So if I go down here, I have like this failure and success area. The visible says go, the label says submit, and that's a failure because if someone's trying to kind of speech to text, the button will not work for them. Now I could have put under my label go, comma, submit. Either one of those would work, and you could use one or the other, and that would activate it, for example, an AT device like that. So tabbing to test, tab through a page and make sure the visible element name matches the announced element name of each focusable element. So you could do that by using a screen reader to kind of listen to what's going on there. Okay, motion actuation. Putting something into action. I wanted to just explain. Okay, first off, what does actuation mean? Putting something into action. So functionality that can be operated by device motion, let's say shaking or any type of user motion, can also be operated by user interface components, and responding to the motion can be disabled to prevent accidental, putting something into action. As we talked about earlier, not everybody can physically move a device. It may be locked, into place. So if you make something an interaction where you can only interact with it by shaking it or doing something like that, it's not going to be accessible. So an example here is we have a slider down at the bottom. We have a screen where there's a slider motion sensor example, and it talks about, so I could tilt, in this example, I could tilt this and it would, decrease or increase the value. Also on the screen, I have a button that I can focus on to decrease or increase that value. Now, it's made known here that you can tilt the device to the right or to the left to adjust the value. You can also disable it. There is a checkbox button. You would need the ability to disable that in the case that someone is moving their, device, but it kind of unintentionally moving it. So just be wary that when you're doing like physical actions like that, that you have the ability to stop them. They're not all that common, but it could be, some little feature that you're putting on there. So anything that requires like a physical movement, you have to have a non-physical way to do that or to disable it. All right, status messages. This again is 4.1.3. This gets into, a web developer role, but it talks about applying these roles behind the scenes. And so in content implemented using markup language, status messages can be programmatically determined through role or properties such that they can be presented to the user by AT without receiving focus. So status messages need to be, AT devices need to be alerted of like pop-up messages or error messages or waiting, loading types of messages so that they know they're there. You may visibly see a loading message, but a blind user doesn't know, so they may think nothing is happening. But if you assign these roles to those elements, so in this case, role equals status, it shows 5 results returned. That would be announced to a assist, like a screen reader, for example. If I'm in a waiting mode, waiting for something to load on the page, if I assign a role equals alert to that message, it will focus for an AT device and they'll know, hey, the application's busy at the moment, loading in progress. A progress bar, if you add the role equals progress, it will announce to you, that the progress bar is there and kind of where you are in the step of the progress bar. It will also announce another role is alert, and it will alert you that the page has errors. And if you add the role equals alert and aria atomic equals true, it will let you know that there are an existence of errors there. So users of the AT who can't see changes or have trouble perceiving visible status messages on a page, such as shopping cart updates or, just entering in data and it's bringing some information back, letting you know that there's error messages. Maybe you skipped some required input fields, for example. So it's going to let you know that there's some errors that exist. Their AT will announce these messages that was visibly added to the page. So kind of doing something behind the scenes to allow AT devices to let them know that there's some things on the page that are in the process of changing. It updated results from a search, or it's letting you know that the application's busy until it reloads the page, things like that. So now we've gone through all of the 12 guidelines. I thought I would kind of go into prioritizing accessibility issues. So this is kind of just suggestions here. And this is just like a list. And the critical, we were kind of talking about this early on, things that stop you in your tracks from an assistive tech keyboard trap. I mentioned that. There's also cases where input fields are entirely skipped and they don't even know they're there. So things like that, when you're testing, you'll realize, hey, it skipped these 3 fields for some reason. We need to go back and fix that. Resizing text, if someone can't resize text and they're low vision, they can't use the site, things like that. So these are more critical. And then these are kind of next level. These are, you know, high priority, kind of that next level. In some cases, they could really kind of hinder how people interact with the site, and just kind of depending. So this isn't all of the 2.0 and 2.1, but it's, you know, it's a part of them. So critical, high, and then, you know, any that remain would be kind of like that next level. So on the horizon for the state of Missouri, we're going to be implementing WCAG 2.2, which is, let's see, oh yeah, it's 5 guidelines, 2A and 3AA. And we're going to start those on October 5 of 2025. And then, as our standard document outlines, a 6-month window to compliance, kind of getting educated, getting comfortable with it, etc., with that deadline of April 5th, 2026. And as Brenda mentioned, we'll be doing a webinar in the fall as that's launched. And then here's just a whole grouping of resources. Links to extensions, link to bookmarklets. I kind of went through and anything that I thought was really exceptionally helpful to like understanding some of the guidelines. I included examples in there. We also, effective December 2024, we have an assistive technology testing toolkit that is now made available through Mo Assistive Technology. And it includes a whole, you know, packaging of AT testing tools, screen readers and speech to text, different things like that, that you can loan 5 weeks at a time, and it's a free loan. So there's a link to more information on that. And then for those of you that just want to do a review of WCAG 2.0, I've got a link to a video there, and it goes over the first 36 minutes of that video goes over Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.0. And then at the top, I do have a link to the W3C, What's New in WCAG 2.1, kind of as a resource for this. And then I do have my email address on this last screen. Is there any, I know we're just a little over an hour. Do we have any questions that have popped up?
We are going to give them a copy of the slides, right, Lainie?
Yep.
Okay, that's what I thought. Yeah, we'll send
Yep.
that out with the link to the recording.
And I see that. Is the text spacing bookmarklet something that we need to request? Good question. Bookmarklets, you do not need to request access because they're simply a bookmark in your browser. What you would have to request is anything that I've referenced that maybe is like an browser extension, or in the case of like the color contrast analyzer, that is a free desktop tool, which is also approved for us to, like the resize window bookmark browser that I have listed on there, that would be something you would have to request because that is actually an extension of your browser, whereas the bookmarklets are just bookmarks and they're not true. It's not, software running inside of your browser.
I apologize, Lainie. I think I told someone because we are not on the intranet in a state building, we don't have to request the extension. So I apologize.
Correct. Yes.
I told someone they didn't have to do that, but if you're in a building, you do.
So let me qualify about requesting access. The requesting access would be for like all the consolidated agencies under that umbrella for the state of Missouri. And then, we've obviously got other states that are included that are listening in that would have their own standards for that, or rules for how you install software. But then we have cases where, like MoAT, where they manage their own desktops and stuff. So
Yeah, Lainey, this was fantastic with the resources. Other individuals have mentioned that. There's a lot of in-depth resources and you made it understandable. I always love that on your trainings because I always get new information myself as well. And on the AT toolkits, thank you for doing a plug for those. Those are just available to individuals in Missouri. However, I will say that if you're in another state, we are happy to share what we did on that and the information and the resources that we put together and the pieces of AT that we put in there to test web pages. It's a lot of fun. Eileen and Lainie and I had a lot of fun putting that together this last fall.
Yep. Yep.
And if you are in Missouri, you can just request that from our webpage.
Got a link to that as well.
And yes, is that Angela? Yes, I will contact you and send you that info for Texas. We would love to share that. So, do we
All
have any
right.
other questions? And feel free to come off mute.